Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 18, Jean-Baptiste Bessières, Marshal, Duke of Istria.
Fidelity and conscientiousness are great assets in life's race, and to these Jean-Baptiste Bessières added great presence of mind and considerable dash. It is not therefore surprising that, in an age when disinterestedness and reliability were notably absent among public men, his force of character pushed him above the ordinary adventurers and caused him to become one of Napoleon's most trusted lieutenants. The Marshal was born at Prayssac in 1768. His father, a surgeon, brought up his son in his own profession. But the outbreak of the Revolution opened a wider field to the audacious young Gascon. Early in 1792, Jean-Baptiste quitted Cahors and the medical profession and started off to Paris as one of the newly enrolled Garde Constitutionnelle. His fidelity and courage were soon put to the test. He aided the royal family in the flight to Varennes and consequently had to seek safety in retirement. But the life of a soldier was as the breath of his nostrils, and 3 months later he managed to enlist in the 22nd Chasseurs, a corps which formed part of the Army of the Pyrenees. There his courage and ability made him conspicuous. Within 3 months of enlisting he was promoted sub-lieutenant. The year 1793 proved a disastrous one for France. Defeat followed defeat. But Jean-Baptiste never despaired, and when success ultimately smiled on the French arms, he had established a reputation as a daring and capable squadron commander. Still, like many another of the successful soldiers of the age, Bessières owed his quick promotion to his early friendship with the great Corsican. It was Murat who called Napoleon's attention to the future commander of the Imperial Guard, and Bonaparte, with his eagle eye, at once appreciated his qualities. When the young chief formed his special bodyguard, called the Guides, he placed him at their head. The new corps was composed of the choicest troops and formed the nucleus of the Imperial Guard. Henceforward, Bessières became his chief's confidant and inseparable friend. It was the rare fidelity that he displayed to his master and his constant attention to detail, his intuitive knowledge of his commander's requirements, and his energy in carrying out his plans, rather than great military genius, which accounted for the emperor's lifelong appreciation of the commander of his guides. At Lonato and Castiglione Bessières proved the correctness of the young Corsican's judgment. At Rovereto, he broke through the center of the Austrian infantry, and with 6 others, captured 2 of the enemy's guns. At the First Battle of Rivoli, in accordance with his general's commands, he laid an ambuscade in the marsh on the Austrian left, which proved the decisive factor in the battle. In the following year, he again distinguished himself at the Second Battle of Rivoli and at the Siege of Mantua. As a reward for his services, Bonaparte sent him to Paris with the official dispatches and the stands of colors won from the enemy, and at the end of the campaign promoted him full colonel, and as a further mark of his confidence appointed him tutor and instructor to his stepson, Eugène. Bessières accompanied Bonaparte to the east and served by his side in Egypt and Syria. The commander of the Guides was among the chosen body of friends who accompanied Bonaparte on his secret return to France. And in Paris, he helped Murat, Lannes, and Marmont to win over the army and took a prominent part in the coup d'état of the 18th Brumaire. Immediately after becoming first consul, Napoleon created the Consular Guard, composed of 4 battalions of infantry and 2 regiments of cavalry. He placed at the head of the infantry Lannes and at the head of the cavalry Bessières. With the cavalry of the Guard, Bessières took part in the famous march across the Alps and in the drawn battle of Marengo. Faithful as he had proved himself in war, he showed his fidelity in peace by exposing the plot of the artist Carracci, and thus by ties of gratitude bound himself closer to the first consul. Tall, good-looking, with a graceful figure and a charming smile, the commandant of the guard captivated everybody by his intelligence and his distinguished bearing, which had a piquant flavor by reason of his adherence to the queue and powder of a bygone age. Rejecting the brilliant match proposed by the first consul, he chose as his bride Mademoiselle La Pézrière, a young lady of a royalist family. The couple were married by a non-juring priest, and far from incurring displeasure, were greatly complimented. For Bonaparte already desired the concordat with the Pope, and saw in the bride a useful supporter of his scheme. Madame Bessières was a great social success, a favorite of Napoleon and a close friend and confidant of Josephine. Everywhere she was welcomed for her beauty, her force of character, and the charm of her manner. During the year of peace and the preparation for the invasion of England, Bessières accompanied the first consul on all his numerous expeditions. To his credit be it said, he protested loudly against the ill-judged execution of the Duc d'Enghien. When the first consul became emperor, he enrolled his friend among his new marshals, not for his military genius, but as a reward for his fidelity, for none knew better than Napoleon how lacking the new marshal was in many of the requisites of a great commander. In 1805, the cavalry of the Guard formed part of the Grand Army, and their commander, by his able backing of Murat, had his share in helping to win the Battle of Austerlitz. During the interval between the Austrian and the Prussian campaigns, the Marshal was busily occupied in Paris in reorganizing and expanding the Guard, and as usual, was in close touch with the Emperor. In the Prussian campaign, Bessières had his first taste of an independent command, and gained great credit for his masterly maneuvering in Poland, where with a weak force he kept the enemy in complete ignorance of the movements of the French and covered the conjunction of the various corps of the army. After the Peace of Tilsit, he was entrusted with the delicate mission of negotiating a marriage between Princess Charlotte of Württemberg and Prince Jerome, the new King of Westphalia. Hardly had he returned to Paris when he was hurried off again on active service, this time to Spain. It was just a week before the disaster of Belen that Marshal Bessières was confronted with a most serious problem. The Spanish levies from Old Castile under Cuesta had effected a junction with the levies of Galicia under Blake and were threatening to overwhelm the weak force of 10,000 men with which the Marshal was attempting to put down the guerrilla warfare in the northern provinces. Bessières had not been the great emperor's confidant for nothing, and he at once saw that, unless he took the initiative, his force was doomed, for the enemy were in overwhelming strength, and every day added to their numbers. He knew well how ill-disciplined their forces were, and he determined to try the effect of a surprise. Everything fell out as he wished. On July 14th, he found the Spanish armies in position outside Medina del Rio Seco, some few miles east of Valladolid. The Spaniards, not knowing whether the French were advancing from the direction of Valladolid or Burgos, had placed the army of Blake on the Valladolid road and that of Cuesta on the Burgos road. Accordingly, the Marshal was able to surprise and defeat Blake, and then to turn and inflict a similar defeat on Cuesta. So far, his dispositions had been excellent, but, as General Foy said, he could organize victory, but he could not profit by it, for he was paralyzed by the extent of the guerrilla warfare with which he was faced, and after a short but bloody pursuit, he called off his troops. Still, he had accomplished much. For the time he had dispersed all organized resistance in the northern provinces and had opened the road to Madrid for King Joseph. But Belen and Vimero proved that the war in the Iberian Peninsula was still only in its first stage. Joseph had hastily to evacuate Madrid, and in spite of having 12,000 French troops under his command, Bessières could effect nothing. The Spanish armies of Cuesta and Blake once again took shape, and like the other French generals, the Marshal had to fall back on the line of the Ebro. Such was the situation in October, when the Emperor himself appeared on the scene. The situation changed like magic at the touch of a master hand. The French troops, strung out in a great semicircle on the Ebro, were quickly concentrated. Blake and Cuesta were each defeated by an overwhelming combination of the different French armies. Meanwhile, the Emperor, recognizing the limitations of his faithful friend, superseded him by SOULT, but gave him the command of the Guard and of the reserve cavalry under his own immediate supervision, and took him back to France when he gave up the pursuit of the English. Napoleon desired to take the Guard with him on the Austrian campaign, and, as several regiments were still in Spain, others had to be enrolled to take their places. These regiments were entirely organized by Bessières and formed the nucleus of what was later called the Young Guard. The marshal's duty during the Austrian campaign of 1809 was the same as in Spain, the command of the guard and of the reserve cavalry. During the famous 5 days' fighting, he proved again that no troops in Europe could resist the charges of the heavy cavalry of the guard, and that he himself had almost as great a command of the technique of cavalry tactics as his famous friend and instructor, the King of Naples. At Aspern and Essling, the cavalry of the guard and the reserve cavalry covered themselves with glory by their dashing charges. Again and again, with cries of "Vive l'Empereur," the glittering masses of cuirassiers attempted to break down the stern handful of indomitable Hungarians who guarded the Austrian batteries. When the bridges were broken and the retreat to the island of Lobau was the only hope for the army, Bessières, with the remains of cavalry, so severely punished the enemy that the retirement was effected in safety. At Wagram, when all seemed lost, Napoleon called on his old comrade to sacrifice himself with his cavalry. As the cuirassiers of the guard trotted past to debouch on their heroic mission, the emperor, waving his sword, cried out, "No sabring! Give point! Give point!" The needed time was gained, and the gallant marshal was wounded. But at the end of the day, when the troopers, after their great effort, could no longer face the unbroken lines of slowly retreating Austrians, Napoleon, chagrined at his failure, met his cavalry and their commander with reproach. "Was ever anything seen like this? Neither prisoners nor guns. This day will be attended with no result." The emperor's ill humor was only temporary. When his most trusted lieutenants were grumbling and longing for peace in which to enjoy the spoil they had collected in war, when Bernadotte and Fouché were openly intriguing against him, Napoleon could ill afford to disregard his most faithful friend. Accordingly, immediately after Wagram, he dispatched the newly created Duke of Istria to Belgium to take over the command of the French troops who were opposing the ill-fated English expedition to the Isle of Walcheren. When the marshal returned from Belgium to Paris, he found that the emperor had made all arrangements for the divorce of Josephine and for his second marriage. Bessières was placed in a very awkward position. Prince Eugène was his greatest friend. Josephine had always been most kind to him and the Duchess, but he could not help them in any way, and, to make matters worse, the emperor insisted on coming and staying with him at his country house at Grignon. Meanwhile, the war in Spain was spoiling many great reputations. Reinforcements were urgently required, so the emperor decided to give his young guard their baptism of fire in Spain. Accordingly, at the commencement of 1811, he dispatched them with Bessières, their commander, to operate on the northern lines of communication. The ill success of the French was palpably due to two causes. There was no commander-in-chief on the spot, the emperor was in Paris, and there was no other marshal whom all the others would obey. Secondly, there was a great want of concentration. As Bessières wrote to Berthier, "All the world is aware of the vicious system of our operations. Everyone sees that we are too much scattered. We occupy too wide an extent of country. We exhaust our resources without profit and without necessity. We cling to dreams. We should concentrate our forces, retain certain points d'appui for the protection of our magazines and hospitals, and regard 2/3 of Spain as a vast battlefield, which a single victory may either secure or wrest from us." Unfortunately, the marshal was human, like his comrades, and instead of loyally backing up MASSÉNA, he came to an open rupture with him on the question of supplies, and by his inaction at Fuentes d'Onoro, he caused the French to lose that battle. Though he made good his excuses before Napoleon and secured the disgrace of the Prince of Essling, in the opinion of the Duke of Wellington, it was Bessières' refusal to lend MASSÉNA assistance which was entirely responsible for the French defeat. Moreover, sound as were his views on the method of conducting war, he had not the personality to impress them on others or the application to put them into practice, and his whole time was occupied in attempting to make head against the guerrilla warfare. His methods were rough and barbarous, and reacted against the French, for he avenged the ill deeds of the guerrillas on their families and womenfolk, and visited with military execution any village which failed to meet his onerous requisitions. So the Spaniards retaliated with revenge, the weapon of the weak, that wild kind of justice. The marshal's blunders were cut short by his recall to Paris at the beginning of 1812 to reorganize the Guard prior to the Russian campaign. The Duke of Istria accompanied the emperor to the front. His individual share was restricted by the fact that the King of Naples was with the army. But during the retreat, he led the van and did yeoman's service in restoring order among the disheartened troops. Early in 1813, he was recalled from Ebling to reorganize the Guard and the reserve cavalry. The task tried to the utmost the marshal's great administrative capacity, for not only was there the question of men and equipment, but above all, he was confronted with the difficulty of providing remounts. In spite of all his efforts, it was impossible to find anything like enough horses for the cavalry, for the guns had to be supplied first. The marshal's share in the campaign was short. At Lutzen, on the eve of the first engagement, he was greatly depressed and possessed by a presentiment of death, which proved only too true. For scarcely had the battle opened when he was struck by a bullet which inflicted a mortal wound. The Duke of Istria has always been among the more unknown of the marshals. The reason for this is clear. As commander of the cavalry of the Guard and organizer of the Young Guard, his greatest work was done in the office at Paris, disciplining, organizing, equipping, and supervising the instruction of these picked troops. His greatest talents were those of administration. As a cavalry leader in the field, he was overshadowed by the brilliant and more striking King of Naples. Still, as a subordinate, he possessed some sterling qualities, as is proved by his actions during the Great 5 Days and by the fierce fight at Aspern-Essling. As an independent commander, he was a failure. Again and again, his moral courage seemed to desert him at the critical moment. In Spain, at Medina del Rio Seco, at Burgos, and at Fuentes d'Onoro, he could not brace himself to take the responsibility of throwing his whole weight into the action. Like many another general, he was sound, but he was unable to rise to the height of those great commanders who intuitively know when to stake their all. Consequently, although he undoubtedly possessed the true military eye, as is shown by the wonderful way he covered the junction of the French corps along the Vistula, and by his clearly written dispatch on the errors of the war in Spain, his military reputation always suffered when he had not his great chief close at hand to stiffen his determination. Napoleon knew full well his weakness, and the reproaches he hurled at him at Wagram were not altogether without ground. Still, the emperor was aware that Bessières' advice was always valuable, because of his clearness of vision and his absolute lack of all bias and prejudice. And while he made allowances for his lack of moral courage, he always listened to him attentively. The army believed that it was his frantic appeal, "Sire, you are 700 leagues from Paris," which deterred the emperor at Moscow from throwing the Guard into the action, and thus permitted the Russians to escape absolute annihilation. As a man, the marshal was loved and respected by all for his absolute disinterestedness and straightforwardness. He was adored by his troops, while he possessed the qualities which enabled him to succeed in the difficult task of establishing an iron discipline in the Guard. It was due to him that, in the Imperial Guard, there was none of that lawlessness which made the Praetorians of Rome a danger to the empire. When not unnerved by responsibility, the marshal was tender-hearted to an extreme. At Moscow, he was foremost in saving the wretched inhabitants from the flames. During the horror of the retreat, he dashed back alone to a deserted camp on hearing the cries of an infant. But when frightened, he could be cruelty itself, as is shown in his terrible decrees against the Spanish guerrillas. Yet even in Spain, his justice was appreciated, and in many a village in Castile, on the news of his death, masses were sung for his soul. Though he lacked the highest moral courage, his physical bravery was proven on many a stricken field from Valladolid to Warsaw. At St. Helena, the great emperor gave his friend a noble epitaph. He lived like Bayard, he died like Turenne.
This concludes Chapter 18 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 19, about Claude Perrin. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.